Hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Spears. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight, and joining me on the panel, health economist Angela Jackson. From the New South Wales Central Coast, Paul Zahra, the CEO of the Australian Retailers Association, which represents over 1 million working Australians. Finance journalist Alan Kohler, who works across the ABC, the New Daily and the Eureka Report. And from Canberra, which is in lockdown tonight, Shadow Minister for Infrastructure and Regional Development, Catherine King, and the National Senator for Queensland, Matt Canavan. It's great to have you all here.
The IPCC has just released its most recent report on climate change, and the message is grim. A code red for humanity has been declared. The science, Matt, is irrefutable, and yet the coalition still seems stuck on climate policy. The Prime Minister is even pushing for a fossil fuel, gas-led recovery. I may be one of the infamous millennials, but at least I'm having a go. I've reduced my meat consumption, I buy renewable power, and I've even signed up to my local fire brigade. So I'll hold the hose, mate, but what's the government going to do?
All right, so the IPCC report out this week says human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that's unprecedented, at least in the last 2,000 years. And it says each of the last 4 decades has been successively warmer than any decade that preceded it since 1850. Matt Canavan, this is a report from 234 scientists, and it's based on more than 14,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers. And yet you've cast some doubt on the findings. What do you know that they don't?
Well, David, I think it's best just to quote some of their own words. So one of the IPCC authors was quoted a few months ago saying that he hoped this report would scare people and that it would scare people enough so that it would help change their vote. Now, that doesn't sound like science to me, and it's, I think, of great shame. It's very sad that the IPCC, who once did very, very good work, and I do agree with their overall findings on climate change, but now it has descended into something that's much more like spin than science. We saw that over the past week.
It probably does scare people, some of these projections and findings.
I mean, why would a scientist want to change people's vote? I mean, you saw the spin over the past week as they drip-fed the fear porn about this, rather than just release the science. Hang on. Indeed, the questioner himself...
You're saying it's fear porn, or are you saying you agree with the findings, which I think you just said?
I said the overall findings. So I'll explain why that's the case. There's a guy called Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. He's a climatologist at the University of Colorado. He's done some really interesting analysis about how in the IPCC report they spent half the time, half of their references to different scenarios was to the most extreme scenario, the so-called RCP or SSP 8.5. And that is, at least the IPCC does recognise in their report that scenario, this time they recognise, is extremely unlikely, but they spend more than half the time focusing on the most unlikely outcome. Outcome, can I just finish here, David? This is a really important point.
Just quickly, yes.
The really important point here is what happens here is the IPCC has assumed in some of these scenarios that coal demand will be double what the International Energy Agency...
In one scenario. This is
one of the experts...
You're talking about the very high emissions scenario. There are 5 scenarios. In all of them, it's projecting that the warming will still hit 1.5 degrees in all of them.
In those 3 ones that do, all of those ones have coal demand being much, much higher than the International Energy Agency predicts. So some experts are wrong, and I'm a big supporter of coal.
But do you agree with this?
Do you agree with this? IPCC projections are loopy. They're just loopy. They're just out of control.
But do you agree with the scenario, all 5 scenarios pointing to 1.5 degrees warming? And coming back to Julian's question, what's the government going to do about it?
Yeah, so look, the government is taking action. In my view, that action is quite futile now because China's not doing anything. And this is the reason why we shouldn't sign up to more reductions, because it would just be a free kick to China right now. China's already stolen thousands of jobs, Australian jobs, through their inability to be trusted under the trade agreements we've signed with them, including their ascension to the World Trade Organisation. And so now the proposal is let's sign another agreement with China, which will mean we'll handicap our own industry.
Right, to take your point there, shouldn't we be putting international pressure on China to do more than the commitments they have already made, rather than giving them an excuse, not to?
Well, good luck with that. I mean, good luck. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party haven't cooperated with health inspectors to find the origins.
Why are they going to do anything if a
haven't.
country like Australia's not?
Well, why is China going to be trusted now when they weren't in the past? I mean, this is why the Prime Minister is right to say what we should be doing is developing the technologies that mean that cleaner energy is more efficient, and then China and other countries will adopt them, of course. But this idea, this wishful thinking that we'll cut all our emissions and somehow China will join us, that's madness.
Alan,
and it will only help empower the Chinese Communist Party, which has got a lot to answer for over the past 18 months.
Alan Kohler, we just throw up our hands and say China's not going to do anything, so why should we?
Well, China is committed to net zero emissions by 2060, so 10 years later than the rest of the world. For them...
I believe that.
No, but that's what their commitment is. I mean, if you know...
Oh, great.
Well, that's what they've said.
What do you want them to do, Matt Canavan?
What are they supposed to do?
Is there anything they could do that you would...
I mean, the thing is that for China to achieve net zero by 2060 is enormously difficult. I mean, the transformation that has to take place for China's economy is phenomenal. I mean, it's far greater than anything anyone else has to do. So, I mean, you're right also. So China's got a commitment that's 10 years after the rest of us. Do we all go, oh, well, we just give up? I mean, that's crazy. I mean, and then the fact is that the burden has to be on the advanced nations, which have all benefited from fossil fuels for the last 150 years. So, you know, America, Europe, UK, Australia have all had a tremendous benefit from fossil fuels. We are the ones who are going to have to pay for it.
Catherine King, let me ask you, the IPCC report this week really emphasises that action is needed in the next decade. Labor's committed to net zero by 2050, but is Australia's 2030 target of lowering emissions by 26 to 28%, is that adequate?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say, particularly in response to Matt, I mean, you know, it's pretty clear and he got a pretty good run there, but, you know, Matt's part of the problem, and it's devastating to watch over the course of the last 20 years since I've been a member of the House of Representatives. We have been unable to elect a parliament that can build consensus and move forward on this. The brief period of time under the Labor government when we did see emissions going down, when we did have some action on climate change, obviously that ended pretty quickly once the Abbott government was elected, and it's incredibly frustrating to people to see that we've just not been able to get there or elect a parliament that can actually agree about what we need to do and then build that consensus. And unfortunately, I think Matt is part of the problem, and quite deliberately so.
But just coming back to the question...
obviously Labor has a...
It's incredibly frustrating we have democracy. It's incredibly frustrating we have democracy. That's the problem.
All right, let's just get an answer to the question.
It's incredibly frustrating that it keeps electing people like you, Matt, I think is the
democracy is the
we
problem.
see. I'm not sure how democratic the Senate is from the National Party's point of view, but anyway.
Whether Australia's 2030 target is adequate.
Yeah, well, it's clear in terms of Labor's position, it's clear that we do believe pretty strongly, you know, we've said that we have the net zero target by 2050. You can't start in 2049 to actually do anything about it. You're going to have a roadmap to get there. It's clear the government's going to have to do so as well. It's, you know, whilst it hasn't committed to a target, it's saying, you know, we do want to get emissions down and we're going to have to do something internationally. Matt's and his ilk are the people who are holding us back.
The other thing to bear in mind, David, is that the report is saying that net zero by 2050 is not enough. Yeah, exactly. I mean, what we have to do in addition to that is to take millions of tonnes of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we haven't really even got the technology for that yet. So the cost of getting to net zero by 2050 is enormous to begin with. And then having to take a whole lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere within a few decades is going to be enormously expensive.
Angela, the Prime Minister talks about technology as the answer here, particularly to drive emissions reduction in developing countries like China, India, Indonesia and so on. Is that a fair enough approach, and is Australia doing enough to drive the technology that's going to be required?
Look, technology is certainly going to be part of the answer, but I think what Australia has done and the path that we have taken isn't the least cost, you know, way for Australia to reduce emissions. We've actually taken a higher cost, less effective way. It's reduced economic growth, and it will reduce the prospects for that innovation and for that technology growth. I'm optimistic. You know, we will have to commit to zero emissions by 2050 because the international community is going to make Australia do that. But, you know, the way that we are doing doing this at the moment, it isn't setting our country up for success. It isn't setting up our kids for success. It's making this a lot more expensive path than we need to.
Well, Paul, this brings in where business is at. What's at stake for Australia when it comes to not only trade penalties we might face, but investment we might lose if we don't go down this path?
Well, this is interesting. A recent survey done in Australia said that Australians are actually 3 times more concerned about dealing with climate change rather than the pandemic, and that's really concerning. So that makes retailers very concerned. And there's a long way to go, and it's very disturbing to hear Matt's comments. And I think there's a leadership void on this particular issue, and we need to see business and industry get more involved. And what we do know is that retailers are prepared. We've got our supermarkets, our Aussie supermarkets in this country are leading the way when it comes to showing other retailers about sustainability. They appear in the top 20 most sustainable retailers in the world. So what I'd like to see is better consultation with business rather than just the fossil fuel industry.
At the end of the day, just to wrap up this discussion, Senator Canavan, you're worried about the cost to Australia. What this report this week tells us once again is the cost of inaction. And in Australia in particular, it says fires are projected to get worse and more frequent. Fire seasons will last longer. Across southern Australia, drought. This is from the report. And across southern Australia...
That's not what the report says.
It does. I'm quoting from the report.
So the report says... The report says that fire weather days will increase. There's actually...
and it also says across southern Australia, drought has already increased and projections suggest that will worsen. I'm quoting from the report.
Yep. So the climate studies, I questioned the CSIRO about this in the Senate only a couple of months ago, that there have been no studies to date linking increased bushfire risk to climate change, because climate change changes a range of things around vegetation growth and what
Tell that to our firefighters, mate. Tell that to our firefighters, really.
OK, well, I'm quoting the scientists, so
really?
It's either we believe the science or don't.
Tell it to the Greeks.
So, I mean...
that's a good point.
Going back...
So, OK, but just to be clear here, are you suggesting there's no link between climate change and bushfires in Australia, Senator?
I'm saying that there's no studies that link that at that stage, at least according to the CSIRO. That's not according to me. That's according to the CSIRO. There's a direct line in the latest report they did on climate change, which says exactly that's from page 52 from memory. I mean, well,
the CSIRO report,
the issue here about
stated the climate report last year was very clear about the warming that has happened in Australia and the impact it's having.
Yeah, no, I accept that. The issue here about the cost is we haven't done any detail.
And it does say, that CSIRO report does say that that climate change is causing an increase in the occurrence of extreme fire weather. That's from the CSIRO.
I agree with that.
So you're cherry picking some things. That's the CSIRO.
Oh, no, it's very important to be precise, David. You didn't say that in your first question, but you're right about that. And in terms of the cost, New Zealand did a study which showed that they would have a 2 to 4% reduction in their employment if they went to net zero, and in equivalent terms that would be around 400,000 jobs here in Australia. So what are we going to do about that? That is a massive, massive impact.
OK, but you're not talking about the job. You're not talking about the job benefits.
So let's adopt this.
Nor are you talking about the job losses from climate change.
No, that's a computable. That does take into account the benefits because it's a computable general equilibrium model, but we haven't done that here. We haven't done any of this. Now, after that modelling, New Zealand exempted their agricultural industry from more than half of their emissions.
All right, we need to move on.
They took into account those costs.
The message from Gladys every day is the same. The only way out of continuous lockdowns are high vaccination rates. However, I feel the reality of the full easing of restrictions to a prior normal will not be the case. With potentially a large number of the population that won't get or be vaccinated, how can we possibly ease restrictions when society still run the risk of spreading the infection in the community?
Now, I should point out too, we've received a number of questions from people frustrated at cases leaking out of Sydney into the regions. We've particularly seen that this week in Byron Bay, Tamworth, Armidale, Walgett, Dubbo. Canberra's now in lockdown as well, as we can see tonight. We're yet to see that being linked, though, to the Sydney outbreak. Angela, we don't know what sort of restrictions Gladys Berejiklian might ease. She's saying she'll have more options if there are 6 million jabs delivered. Should any restrictions be eased at that point?
Look, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to go to what the restrictions necessarily should be. What I can say, I think, for the people of Sydney, and I think Luke's question goes to this, is that the uncertainty that they're living with at the moment is pretty much unbearable. As human beings, I know as an economist, we deal with risk quite well, but with this uncertainty is really, really difficult. And I think, as you know, as someone who lived through Victoria lockdown last year, when that announcement came at the beginning of September from Premier Andrews that what the roadmap looked like, what the targets were, there might have initially been a bit of swearing at the television, a little bit of upset, a bit of depression. It wasn't a great day. But what that gave us was a clear roadmap out. It gave us certainty about what we were heading for. And I really think now, for me, that's what Sydney needs. It needs to know, well, what are the vaccination targets? What do the case numbers have to be at each level of vaccination for them to come out safely? They should have that modelling, and I think it is time to share it because, I mean, you know this, people in Sydney, they're suffering. They're suffering under this uncertainty of, every day these cases go up, it's not clear where they're actually heading.
So more clarity on
I think
that.
they need certainty and they need a plan.
Yeah, Paul, Zahra, I mean, would you like to see any easing of restrictions before the 70 and 80% vaccination thresholds agreed by National Cabinet are met?
Look, I think there can only be one umpire here, and that's the health professionals, and we've been following their advice, to be really frank. We were very much against lockdowns as an industry last year, but that was different to what we're seeing today with the Delta strain. It's a very different proposition, of course. So it's highly infectious, and the only ticket out to freedom is vaccinations. And the biggest issue really is around inventory and getting access to vaccinations right now. So it's the only silver bullet we've got.
So, Catherine King, if the New South Wales Premier did receive health advice that it's okay to ease some restrictions in parts of Sydney once they're at 6 million jabs and allow some greater freedom, do you think she should do it or wait until that agreed 70 and 80%?
Well, I think that, the first thing to say is, we feel awful for the people in Sydney. ACT's just gone into lockdown. Melbourne's still in lockdown today, and regional Vic, my hometown, has come out. But there's a lot of, anxiety about, is that going to last? And I think the reality is we all need Sydney to get through this, and we've all got to make sure that we're singing from the same song sheet. I think it is important that there's a national plan. There's a plan that's been agreed around the level of vaccination for restrictions to start easing, and I think the Premier of New South Wales needs to listen to the health experts, but she also, for the rest of the country, needs to make sure that she sticks to that plan that's been agreed. The fact that we are here, though, is so frustrating for, particularly, those of us from Victoria who have been through this. We spent a long time in lockdown last year, contributed nationally to keeping everybody safe by the decisions that Premier Daniel Andrews took and all of the sacrifices we made, and it just feels as though it's been squandered because of this debacle of a vaccine rollout where we've only got 19% of the population fully vaccinated, and we're having this Hunger Games between priority populations versus states about how we manage all of this because, frankly, the Morrison-Joyce government just did not do its job.
Alan Kohler, this decision that Gladys Berejiklian is presumably going to make in the coming weeks is going to be a critical one in this pandemic. The other states all have a stake in this as well. How do you think they're going to feel if New South Wales does start to ease restrictions too soon? And what about the Prime Minister? Does he need to stand up with more national leadership on what should be done here?
Well, we've learnt for a start that the Prime Minister doesn't run the show anymore. It's the states who do it. Part of the reason this has been an epic stuff-up is not just the vaccine rollout, but there's different standards of lockdowns across the country. All the premiers are doing different things. So, yeah, I mean, obviously it'd be terrible if Gladys Berejiklian opened up New South Wales too early. The other thing to say is that this so-called plan is not really a plan. It's a sort of a guess by the National Cabinet as what might happen, because the lockdowns are called in response to actual cases, not according to a percentage of vaccination. So they're saying they think that when they get to 70 or 80% vaccination, then might be able to ease lockdowns, but they don't know. I mean, and also the 70 or 80% is of the adult population. That's 54% and 63% of the total population. So there's a lot of confusion about when we're talking about percentages, what are we talking about? Is it the adult population or is it total population? Nobody kind of knows.
Well, the agreement's on the adult population, is it? The over 16, as you say.
That is true.
That's a lot lower if you include kids.
But when Gladys Berejiklian says 50% of the population in New South Wales, is she talking about the total or the adult?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because she's talked about 6 million jabs, which isn't even necessarily 50% of the population. It's less than that if it's 6 million jabs. Catherine King, I can see you expressing some concern there. Do you think that is still not cautious enough?
I think given the case numbers that we're seeing in New South Wales, then I don't think it is cautious enough. I think it is absolutely sensible to be trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible. And we saw, obviously, in Victoria, we see when there's lockdown, the demand for vaccines goes up again, and we clearly cannot keep up with that demand with the supply that we've got currently. Let's hope we get our way out of it. But it is absolutely clear, I think, that is the lockdown that is going to be the thing that really gets New South Wales out of this. And I think there's lots of examples in other states as to what's worked. It's in all of our interests that we help New South Wales as much as possible, because we do not want to see continued lockdowns, continued stress and being put on people right the way across the country. And we really want them to get out of this, and whatever help New South Wales needs, then we should be giving them.
Hi. My question is, why is it that Gerry Harvey can keep $22 million in JobKeeper despite making a $462 million profit, yet the government is indebting over 11,000 Australians to repay $32 million, even though the circulation of this money is the most likely reason the economy did not plunge into a deep recession?
So there's a couple of issues here, and we'll get to whether the government should be clawing back money from individuals who may have been overpaid a bit of JobKeeper and JobSeeker, but the businesses, and Gerry Harvey's mentioned there. Paul Zahra, the Australian Retailers Association, does represent Harvey Norman, as I understand it. Should Gerry Harvey pay the money back?
Well, we do represent Harvey Norman, one of 7,500 other retailers, I might say, and the majority didn't claim JobKeeper, or if they did, paid it back. So unfortunately, Harvey Norman's been played out in the media consistently. It's one example.
And what's your answer on that?
Well, look, if I was in the same position, I would have paid it back. But it's a question around individual management and decisions based on leadership, again, around what people believe.
You're saying there's a lack of leadership there?
Well, no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it's different styles of leadership. I think they got it. They were entitled to it. They've chosen not to pay it back. It's a decision that they've made. And it's not for me really to respond on why they didn't.
Alan Kohler, there are, the numbers are well reported now. $4.5 billion in JobKeeper went to businesses that boosted their revenues. $12.5 billion went to businesses that didn't actually meet the requirement of dropping 30%.
I think it was a bit more than that, but anyway.
$12.6 billion, I think. Well, so what should happen here?
I think what should happen is that the people the businesses that got JobKeeper should all be exposed on a website. There should be a register of JobKeeper payments. $225 million has been given back. 90% of that money has come from ASX-listed companies because it was exposed to the public. I mean, Gerry Harvey's unusual because he's an ASX-listed company and he doesn't give a bugger what anyone thinks. So most of the companies that are ASX listed gave it back because everyone could see that they got it. But most of the companies that are private companies that got it and didn't deserve it didn't give it back, and we don't know about them.
So, Matt Canavan, can the government really claim to be worried about debt if it's not going to claw back these billions of dollars?
You can't change the rules after the fact, David. I suppose just everyone viewing tonight, ask yourselves if the government had made a payment to you and they found out later it was too much and should have been less, but they had no legal right to take it back, and we went and asked you, pretty please, can you pay it back? Would you do it? Probably most of us wouldn't, because we'll just waste it. Giving money to Canberra is probably the stupidest thing ever to do.
So were the rules wrong in the first instance? Was this designed poorly?
Obviously we could all be Monday experts on these types of programs, but the JobKeeper program did its job.
But was this a massive loophole?
About to get to that. It did its job, and keep in mind how quick this had to be put in place. So it was inevitable that there was going to be some issues. Also keep in mind, everybody at the time, the health experts, all of us, imagined that we would have a very large coronavirus outbreak occurring in the first few months of last year. That didn't happen, and that's why we've had a lot of this extra money. So the program was designed for an event which, was predicted by all, but didn't happen. So it's completely understandable, the outcomes, even though, of course, if we knew what we knew now back then, we would have done it differently.
Alan?
But
We possibly need to remember why this happened. Why did these companies get the money that they shouldn't have got? And it was because the government said to businesses, forecast. It wasn't so much whether your profit, your revenue fell by 30%. It's do you think it will? And then all these companies said, of course, said they think that our profit's going to fall, our revenue's going to fall by 30%. And then the government didn't check up later.
Nor is there a public list of who.
No, there's no
received
public
it.
list. And they all got it for 6 months, no questions asked. And at the end of that time, they didn't check up whether they were right in their forecast
that's not exactly
of revenue.
Right, but yeah, okay.
I mean, heavens above.
You could claim it if you had 1 month. You could claim it. You could claim it if you had 1 month reduction and you didn't have to show future months. So you had to have 1 month of reduction, which a lot of people did because the initial impact.
Well, of course, that's right.
Okay, but at the end of the day,
and then we didn't. Yeah.
Coming back to Demi's question, it's why let the businesses keep the cash, the billions of dollars, but claw back from 11,000 Australians, what is it, $22 million in JobKeeper overpayments. Matt Canavan, you're saying that's okay? You seriously think that's a good look?
Well, David, those are the rules for those payments. So that there's a legal right for the government to do that, and of course we're stewards of your money. If there's a legal right that someone has been overpaid, we should do that because we've got to try and make sure we spend your money as frugally as possible. I know there are other people who think it doesn't matter how much we spend, but it is really important. We've got the largest debt here now.
I think we're all agreeing we care about wasting billions of dollars on businesses that didn't need the help. Catherine King, do you think, has the horse bolted, as the Senator suggests, too late to get this money back from those businesses?
Well, no, I don't think it is, frankly, because governments make laws and change laws all the time, and I think it's frankly, it looks obscene. When you've got this, billions of dollars for companies that have paid, their shareholders out and executives out, and yet you've got people who lost jobs, lost hours, they're still struggling, and the government's pursuing, maybe $1,000 in JobKeeper payments that they, and pursuing them pretty heavily. I just think it looks obscene, and frankly, the government's got its priorities wrong about this.
And
I think it
how
needs
do
to
you
go back
design?
and
Let's
have
just
a
go
think
back
about what the effect is on people.
Go back to the beginning. How do you design a $90 billion program, the biggest program in Australia's history, giving money to people, without having the remit to say, we're going to check that you actually needed this money? The scale of the mismanagement
it's gobsmacking.
is huge.
It is.
I mean, $90 billion, the amount of waste, it is massive. I understand it was, done at a speed of light. I understand that it was poorly targeted for those reasons. But how don't you go, you know what, we better put a clause in here in case we get it wrong. This is public money. You might not think you need it, but it is public money, $90 billion of it. I don't know.
Paul?
I can't believe it.
The speed was really important, though. I just want to add that. The speed to get that money out was really important. It did stimulate the economy. Yep. Most of those dollars, we saw that in the retail tills, was spent, and it really did not only stimulate the economy, it kept people in jobs. So it had a dual effect. I'm certainly not contesting what you're saying.
I don't think anyone's denying that, because I think, Paul, it was really, is incredibly important. But I was just reflecting back on it as, we're in this lockdown in Canberra here. I mean, we were all sent home from Parliament. We were sent home and told Parliament wasn't going to sit until August. There was no need for a wage subsidy. It was only, businesses, unions, Labor, we were all saying, look, are you sure about this? This doesn't seem right. So the government did have a little bit of time. It called us back, and of course it's been incredibly important, but it's now got to wear the consequences that it was a poorly designed scheme and that there are these billions of dollars that was in waste. And, they claim to be great economic managers. Well, I think that claim now has proved to be abundantly false.
We should remember where we started this, which is that JobKeeper was fine last year. It was a debacle because all the money was stolen. But we need something this year because we've got the Delta variant now. We've got lockdowns all over the place.
That's the biggest
and we
issue.
haven't got it. I mean, we haven't got it now. So what we need
But we've
is...
got the same payment. It's the same amount of money. It just goes differently.
It doesn't keep that connection with your employer.
And it doesn't subsidise your wage, Matt. I mean, you'd understand as an
we've
economist, you know, if you give $750 to a business, they're more likely to maintain the wage of the worker. And so this sets a minimum floor rather than, you know, underpinning the person's individual wage. It's a very different payment.
That is all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Angela Jackson, Paul Zahra, Alan Kohler, Catherine King and Matt Canavan. And thank you for all your stories and questions tonight. Next week, I'll be back with you from Melbourne for a Q&A youth special. They're increasingly catching this virus, so should we be vaccinating our kids in all the states? Plus, we'll look at the impact of lockdowns and homeschooling. On the panel, Norman Swan and Anthea Rhodes, joining students Patria Havardis and Arth Tuteje. See you then. Good night.